Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome to our webinar. We'll get started soon. Thanks to everyone who is joining on time. Yeah. All right, we have a good crowd so far. All right, we have a few more people trickling in. We'll give them the rest of the registrants another minute to join, then we'll get started. Hope everyone is having a great day so far. All right, we still have people coming in. Make sure they all get admitted. Okay. We'll probably have some other folks joining us, but I'll go ahead and get us kicked off with the introduction of the webinar. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining our first webinar in a series we're calling MJBizCon Backstage. This will be a monthly webinar series highlighting previous speakers at MJBizCon and speakers that will be at MJBizCon in 2026. The industry currently stands at a pivotal moment. Growth opportunities are expanding across both marijuana and hemp markets, but so are the challenges. The industry faces fragmented regulations, persistent compliance hurdles, and limited investment and innovation opportunities. Today's conversation brings you inside a series of high-level, closed-door discussions aimed at changing that reality. We're joined by leaders at the center of a coordinated industry effort convened by Adam Rosenberg, chairman of the National Cannabis Industry Association, and guided by Eric Berlin of Dentons, focused on aligning the voices of major cannabis organizations across the U.S. Their goal is to identify the most pressing regulatory barriers and develop actionable, unified strategies to address them. Building on the momentum from their session at MJBizCon 2025, our panelists will share fresh insight into how this coalition is moving from dialogue to action. They'll explore which reforms are truly within reach in the near term, how businesses can effectively engage in shaping policy, and what it will take to unlock sustainable long-term growth for the industry. This is a rare opportunity to hear directly from those helping to shape the future regulatory framework of cannabis in the United States. So with that, I'll hand it over to Adam Rosenberg to get us kicked off.
Thank you, Chris. So I can provide a brief introduction and then allow Eric to do the same. And then happy to answer any questions from attendees on the efforts and prospects of continued collaboration. So I am currently serving as the chairman of the board of the National Cannabis Industry Association, which is a volunteer role to represent the stakeholders of the cannabis ecosystem in improving federal policy. I've spent my whole adult life within the cannabis space, starting from recognizing the therapeutic potential of the plant while in high school, working as a bud tender in college, and then founding the first student organization in the country focused on professional development for the industry called Green Wolverine, as a way of bringing more young talent into the space, to use the industry as a tool for therapeutic access. Since then, I've worked across varying aspects of both hemp and marijuana, from cultivation, manufacturing, and retail. And I also work as an advisor in the biopharmaceutical space, developing prescription drugs using the FDA pathway. So with that, I'll open it up for Eric to share more of his impressive background.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you for all the great work you're doing. And thank you to Chris for hosting us. So I'm Eric Berlin. I have been an attorney now for 33 years and in the cannabis space for 18 of those. I lead the cannabis group at Dentons, which is the largest firm in the world. And for most of those 18 years, and for certainly the last decade, I've dedicated 100% of my time to clients and advocacy in the cannabis space. And just as a point of background as to how I got originally involved, I was the attorney who helped craft and get passed the Illinois medical cannabis law. I was then brought into Ohio to redraft that bill and help get that passed. And really from then, I have been full-time dedicated to safe, legal, affordable access to cannabis for those who would benefit from it. And I will say, from my perspective as someone who's been working for 18 years toward the legalization of medical marijuana, this is a good and exciting week for me. And I know there are varying views of what has happened. So I'll look forward, Adam, to talking about that and talking about the kind of progress that we've made.
Absolutely. Thanks, Eric. And for the attendees, first to provide an overview of the efforts being discussed. Around a year ago, after assuming the role with NCIA, I decided to attempt to bring the disparate voices of the cannabis movement together to try to shape a more unified strategy. That started with a meeting encompassing not just the business groups, but also groups focused on social justice reform, doctors, law enforcement, testing labs, industrial hemp, really just trying to bring all of the voices together to recognize that we all share the same movement and that we can get further through working together. And then those initial discussions evolved into meetings that have included nearly all of the major groups representing the marijuana and hemp businesses, with the idea being to try to shape a more consolidated framework, recognizing that policy should be based on the end product and not the source material, and having completely separate channels and completely separate requirements. And so we have hosted 5 meetings now to this point. And recently we published an op-ed in Marijuana Moment, which included 10 statements of agreement. And those cover a variety of policy topics and establish a foundation of consensus that we can now continue to discuss and work toward sharing resources in trying to reform policy that gets us all out of this extremely challenging and uncertain time. And just to address the recent news as it relates to these efforts, we have been working together across these marijuana and hemp groups to overcome what has been a bifurcated regulatory system between hemp being an unscheduled set of compounds and marijuana being Schedule I controlled substances. And what's interesting about the recent news is we actually created a trifurcation where now if a marijuana product is adult use, it's Schedule I. If it's a medical product, it's Schedule III, while at the same time, these nearly identical products sold as hemp are unscheduled. So while in many ways it is a step in the right direction, it adds to the importance of conversations among our industry and among our community to make sure that we are all rowing in the same direction toward reform that serves patients, consumers, and businesses alike.
Hey, Adam, would it be helpful for me to describe what the final order is doing and not doing, just so that we're all on the same page and have clarity on that?
Yes, that would be great.
Sure, I can do that. So, because I read a lot of stuff online, and we're also, happy to answer questions, but I'll try to provide some clarity here. So, um, what has now been posted as a final order signed by the acting attorney general was in response to President Trump's executive order that cannabis be rescheduled to 3 in the most expeditious manner. And so the final order does several things. Number one, it moves medical cannabis to Schedule 3, and it includes in the definition of medical cannabis not just FDA-approved drugs containing cannabis, but the cannabis that is dispensed through the state licensed, regulated, and taxed medical cannabis programs. So at the point that that was signed, the medical cannabis in the state programs moved to Schedule 3. The next part was really significant and in many ways further than many people expected the government to go, which is they also provide a legal pathway for the state licensed medical cannabis operators. They have to file a DEA registration, and at the point of filing it, are deemed federally legal under the Controlled Substances Act. So those who get a DEA registration will be operating legally, we would say, under all applicable laws, right, as opposed to just under state law. And we'll get to some of the implications of that later, but I just want to make clear, my team is the portal to file DEA registrations was supposed to open at 9 a.m. Eastern time today. There were delays. It just opened, like just as we were signing on, but there was a glitch. So, I mean, this is what's intended, but not too surprisingly, there are a few glitches in the process. That leaves the question of what happens to adult use. And adult use cannabis, as Adam pointed out, remains Schedule 1 for now. That said, there is a hearing scheduled. There is a hearing scheduled to start on June 29th and to finish on July 15th. And really, the point of that hearing is to get adult use cannabis rescheduled to Schedule 3 as well. And my perception of why there is that divide is that the government was trying or was doing a good job to make sure they are following international law, to make sure that the order itself is bulletproof, meaning, uh, certain groups have already said they're going to sue no matter what happens, right? And so we anticipate lawsuits. And I think the government understood that they could reschedule medical cannabis as it's defined without going through a hearing, but they could not do that to adult use. So in some way, this is really good because they didn't delay medical as well. So I sort of am seeing this as more of a glass half full or more than half full. Well, I understand others are seeing it slightly differently. The final order also speaks about 280E, and we anticipate that the IRS, as it has said it will issue greater clarity and some guidance on how it will handle 280E. But what we know now is, at least for medical cannabis, 280E will not apply as of January 1, 2026. And I actually anticipate that the retroactivity will go back further than that. So that's what the order did and does. And Adam, we can talk about implications. We can talk about implications the rest of the week, but I'll hand it back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. It's a perfect breakdown. And while, there's certainly mixed opinions, it, from the perspective of both medical and adult use cannabis, each one is in a better position today than it was prior to the order. Medical cannabis now Schedule 3, 280Es removed, potential retroactive 280E relief, which is a concept that NCIA had written a white paper on a while back. But also, if we look at adult use cannabis, they could have kept the order to medical, and they chose to schedule these hearings, which were not on the schedule prior to this announcement. So both medical and adult use now have very positive momentum. And what was unexpected, as Eric mentioned, was it went further than a conventional rescheduling process, which would still render the whole dispensary system illegal. And it went as far as legitimizing the medical dispensary model as a framework for selling these products in compliance with federal law, which is in effect legalizing medical cannabis, which was a surprise compared to the expectations. So the hope is the hearing process will result in a favorable outcome for adult use, and then all of those products will no longer have 280E applied going forward, with at least on medical potential for retroactive relief.
Yeah, well, and that's correct. And we don't know what's going to happen, right? I mean, I can't sit here and promise any result, of course, but if we fast forward several months from now into the fall, let's just say we're in a situation where adult use also gets scheduled to Schedule 3, and there's retroactivity to the beginning of the year, at least that on adult use and certainly medical, because the IRS has basically already said that. At that point, we're better off than most people thought. What most people were hoping for was a rescheduling of cannabis to Schedule 3 and having the 280E relief. And in fact, what's going to happen is medical cannabis. And by the way, we don't anticipate immediately that same pathway for adult use. So it'll be rescheduled and have 280E relief, but won't have the pathway to full federal legality as medical does. But a medical operator or someone who carves out their medical operations will be a fully legal business, right? And will be able to avail itself of all the things that fully legal businesses do. And that's a terrific result. And quite frankly, I would express my gratitude and appreciation to everyone who was involved in that, including the President of the United States.
Yeah. And it's, of course, significant even just in principle of acknowledging the therapeutic potential of this plant after 56 years, which is the reason both Eric and I are in this business, is knowing the countless stories of people who have found relief and the tragedy of the countless more who have been unable to access this plant in any form for healing purposes. And this new order also illustrates the disparate commercial positioning that the businesses throughout the cannabis world are experiencing, whether you are a hemp business or a medical marijuana business or an adult use marijuana business. Now, even more than before, there are discrepancies in access to resources, in taxation, in regulation. And so it's just important as these regulations evolve that we as a community remember that the real enemies are those outside of our industry. They are the ones that are prohibitionists that are trying to keep these products out of the hands of legal businesses and in the hands of illicit operators. And we have to just keep in mind that whether we agree on every particular topic or not, we all share the same mission and the same movement. And that's why Eric and I have been leading these discussions to this point. And now we will continue to lead those with the hope of creating a more consolidated federal framework that acknowledges the similarities of products and really focuses on the end product, the intoxicating potential, and the safety for consumers.
Adam, I feel like as we've had these discussions, there actually is a lot of agreement about what cannabis and cannabis products should look like in like 20 years, right? I mean, if we step back and say, hey, what does safe, legal, affordable access and normalization of cannabis look like in 10 years, whatever number we choose, but it's something in the future, we end up with a lot of agreement about what that should look like and how extensive that should be, and making sure that kids don't have access, but not recriminalizing that. And so it's interesting that we have a lot of shuffling of the uh, position players or the board or whatever analogy we want to use as we're working toward that eventual goal. And so, I mean, that is a point I want to make standing alone. But the second point I want to make and kind of hand it back to you is we're getting increased clarity about what legal and regulated cannabis is going to look like kind of at the end of the year. We have more clarity now than we did several months ago. And even on the hemp side, the window of getting any change to the amendment of the definition of hemp is getting narrower and narrower. So we're going to be dealing with slightly different board of chess players when we get back together. What are your thoughts as to how we make sense of that?
Yeah, and first to reiterate that in these discussions, we found an extraordinary amount of agreement on the principles of what a properly regulated cannabis industry looks like. It was productive in identifying commonality and also in identifying what the differences really are and realizing that there are few and they are fringe issues that can be handled after making significant forward progress that can support all of the different types of businesses. And for what that looks like now going forward, to Eric's point, we could have a completely different set of incentives and different set of players by the end of the year than we have today, where the hemp operators have benefited from being in an unscheduled category and in having certain federal protection and access to business resources. We could find ourselves in a completely opposite position by the end of the year if the hemp redefinition goes into effect and these businesses in hemp are either Schedule 1 or they are Schedule 3, but outside of any recognized state legal system. It could flip to where these medical cannabis operators now are the ones that are operating in alignment with federal law. And what I believe of the right approach to working together and shaping policy is that we can all benefit from establishing some certainty in policy. When there is a lack of consistency in regulations and there's a lot of volatility and variability, every type of business suffers because they are unable to make informed decisions on long-term strategy. And by working together to try to figure out the landscape of the rules going forward, that's going to help operators make decisions of where they want to position themselves. And we're just going to continue to host these conversations and work together among what is a very flexible situation of federal policy and impacting these different types of businesses.
So I'm gonna say something. I don't want anyone to take it like too literally or hang on the word or blast me for it, but it's in a sort of thematic sense. Um, if in fact there's no change to the amendment of the definition of hemp, and we now have had legalization on medical cannabis, in some ways, medical cannabis and hemp have switched positions from that federal point of view. And I mean that by the sense, I mean that in several ways, but in some ways I mean it like hemp was considered fully legal. It was able to get banking, intellectual property protections, capital market, and public exchange access. Um, they didn't, there wasn't a ton of it, but there was bankruptcy. They had access to bankruptcy courts. And now medical cannabis operators, there's some complexities to that, but medical operators should be similarly situated. And I think that'll change the conversation, not to what the eventual goals will be, but kind of how we get there. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree. And it will be really interesting how it plays out in terms of businesses repositioning themselves to align with new federal policy, where previously the incentive had been as much as feasible to fit into the hemp category, to be immune from 280E, to have the benefits of interstate commerce as a federally legal substance. And now we might see that shift into the greatest benefits being within the medical marijuana licensing program. And we might see more of these businesses determining if or how much of their products should even be within the adult use category. I am also anticipating, if it plays out how it is currently on track, we might see some of these states without marijuana programs and with exclusively hemp programs reshaping the language of their regulations so that their existing operators selling THC products can fall under the medical cannabis or adult use cannabis framework as a way of fitting into this now federally legal category. So while a lot of hemp operators previously had been incentivized to keep as much distance from the hardships of marijuana regulation as possible, we might see that completely reverse, because now the medical marijuana category, at least, is finding itself in a fully legal federal category.
Um, I see there's a question, and we'll try to get to that about the applicability of tribally owned cannabis businesses. But I want to raise one issue that I haven't seen raised a lot, which is in the discussion in Texas around hemp. A lot of that discussion was about veterans and others accessing hemp product for medicinal purposes, really. Um, and that is a large part of why Governor Abbott vetoed the complete hemp ban. Um, and so we know that a lot of folks out there were using hemp or, what's sold as adult use products medicinally. And I don't think insurance companies were fixing quickly to insure hemp products. But now that medical cannabis, supported by a physician's certification, uh, is both state and federally legal, I am hopeful there will be health insurance coverage. And I understand that none of what we're talking about happens like that, right? I mean, what we're talking about is an iterative process. But I would hope to see medical cannabis, state licensed medical cannabis covered by insurance companies. And I think that would be a tremendous advancement forward. As to the process you spoke about, like how is each state going to handle this change? Uh, I think we're going to continue to see an iterative process, right? I mean, it's always very responsive, reactive, whatever word we want to use. And I think that some states may maintain a separate hemp program. Some states may put hemp products into the cannabis program. I would hope, and I know that I will work toward states expanding their medical cannabis program. Right now that it's federally legal, it should be treated like any other medicine, whereas any physician can prescribe it, certify for it for any patient for any condition within the doctor's standard of care, right? I'm not saying that can be ignored by any, and nor would I suggest that. But I'm just saying that if you open it up to the doctor or the medical experts discretion as opposed to state legislatures having a long list of horrible conditions. I think that would be positive as well. And I'm hoping that we'll see those changes. But I should say it's going to take time. And I think it's going to be a sort of a multi-year process. And perhaps in the middle of that, we'll have another change that states will have to react to.
Yeah, exactly right, Eric. And where Eric and I have our optimism is it's easier to make forward progress when there is already momentum. And for 56 years, we were stuck in a period of complete inertia. And now that we have progress moving forward already with medical cannabis and with the hearings scheduled for adult use, there will be inevitable repercussions from those orders that can result in more discussion, more legislation, and that progress can happen both at the federal level as well as with states now aligning toward the guidance that the federal government has provided for cannabis distribution for the first time.
Yeah. I see Steve D'Angelo, who has been at this so long, and we have so much respect for him, has asked the question, won't doctors be limited to prescribing FDA-approved drugs? And these are issues, Steve, that we're just working our way through on the legal side, but let me give you my interpretation as of April 29. Doctors can only prescribe FDA-approved drugs. They can recommend to patients all sorts of things, and many of those other all sorts of things are covered by insurance. So what this change in the law under the final order permits is under a state license program, every state license program has some mechanism for patients to get certified and then go be able to purchase cannabis. And that is now federally legal. Like the doctor making that recommendation in the same way that a doctor may make a recommendation and might even fill out paperwork for you to go do the next step, for you to get PT, for you to do yoga, for you to go see a sleep specialist. And none of those are FDA approved per se, but they are legal under law, so they would be in the similar category. I mean, the government is what this order says is, and Health and Human Services made a similar observation that these states are highly regulating medical cannabis and highly regulating how it goes to market. And because of that, the under international law, the U.S. government is, this is not a legal term, but trusting the states to do this and making that as a legal way for this medicine to go to market.
Yeah, I agree with Eric's point, which is insurance companies can cover more than just prescription drugs, but also to add that the way that medical cannabis has been rescheduled is completely unprecedented. Conventionally, Schedule 3 controlled substances are all limited to prescription drugs sold through pharmacies. So they have made an extraordinary exception to the traditional meaning of Schedule 3 substances in allowing these state licensed marijuana businesses to be legitimized and recognized as compliant distributors of those products. So between that and the fact that the program was put in place around CBD for Medicare patients to access up to $500 a year worth of product, it's possible that more programs could be in the future for recommending cannabis from physicians and having that covered by insurance, both in line with more conventional insurance services, but also because we have seen a willingness to bend the rules around Schedule 3 substances as it relates specifically to access for the cannabis plant.
Adam, I want to push back a little bit on you said extraordinary. And it is because it's in that very specific use of the word, it's unusual because we have not had a substance like this that clearly has medicinal value and is not as dangerous as a Schedule 1 or 2 drug that was scheduled under Schedule 1. But it is what the government did was legally appropriate. And I don't want to suggest that it was, bizarre in that way. I mean, what they were doing with the final order was making sure that there's compliance under international law. And under the Controlled Substances 811D, Section 811D permits the Attorney General to reschedule a substance without even going through that extra process. And what Attorney General Blanche said is, I considered all that because it's there and I could, but I didn't have to. And it supports this decision anyway. So um, the rescheduling itself is entirely appropriate. And what the legalization pathway is, um, I want to choose my words carefully here. It is unusual, and it's not something that we have in our country in the way that we're thinking about cannabis, but we certainly have it in the way that we're thinking about, other things that doctors recommend doing, right? And so in that sense, it's normal and it's just sort of extraordinary because it's cannabis. But I'm sorry to like have a moment of disagreement, but I just want to use that word really carefully because I don't want to suggest that anything the government did here was inappropriate because that's not the case.
Yeah, that makes sense. And uh, I was referring to the how unusual to allow these Schedule 3 substances to be sold
Yeah.
outside of pharmacies, which is a unique development and one that speaks to this administration's clear motive to expand access for these products, which is certainly a difference from the administrations that we have seen over the past few decades, where we've had a lot of talk around it, but now we actually see the action that is going to result in many more people having cannabis as a real therapeutic alternative.
Let's just talk about that for a second. Like, so it's different. It's legal, but different. And I understand that. But that's a lot of what this president is about, right? I mean, he with this action cut through decades of red tape. I mean, and so I don't think I'll speak for myself. I don't, I know this will be controversial as well. I don't really need the FDA to tell me anything more about cannabis. I'm a medical user. I use it, and I don't need it to be more complicated than me going to the dispensary and purchasing it. I like other things, more consistency, particularly the products I like, but like it didn't need to get more complicated than it is. And instead of making it more complicated, the President and Attorney General Blanche made it less complicated, and made it so there is greater legal access to cannabis. And it's just that I think is that's a good thing. And I know it's unusual, but like that's amazing that we've reached this point as opposed to making it hundreds of times more complicated.
Yeah,
I see
exactly.
that I see that Chris has a question, and I see there are a few
Yeah,
other questions posted. Go ahead, Chris. Not a
I'm
question,
loving
maybe you
this
have
insight
a
into
direction.
loving. Yeah, I'm loving this insight into rescheduling and how it impacts the industry. I want to make sure we have a little bit of time to talk about your work at NCIA and how this new kind of rescheduling announcement impacts what you all are doing. And then we can go into questions after that. And if anyone has a question, feel free to put it in the chat or in the Q&A feature, and we'll try to address it.
So
Yeah.
let me run through a few things, and then I'll hand it to Adam. And I'll be really quick about this. I'm not Adam. Maybe you'll talk about end product source material, but when you talk about where we actually were in the points of agreement, age restrictions, and that other than patients should be restricted to adults 21 years and older. That hasn't changed. Synthetic cannabinoids that are not naturally found in the cannabis plant should be part of something else if they're going to be there, but not, sold here. And that actually, the final order supported that, right? So the commission, as we call it, had already agreed on that, and the final order made that the law. And then just distinguishing distribution channels, and just making sure there's consistent standards for labeling, testing, quality control, and product safety, and getting more uniform across states. What happened has not hurt that. It hasn't really pushed it forward, but it hasn't hurt it. And then the federal oversight, and we'll see how that plays out. Um, that states should still have authority over the availability of products and how they are distributed to consumers. That has not been harmed and, in fact, has been helped. And then interstate commerce. There should be interstate commerce of wholesale cannabis products, with a reasonable transition period for that occurring. What has occurred has only helped that. Traceability and product authentication standards, that's something that we agreed on. And this final order does not really have direct implications on that, but if anything, it helps. And licensing, that states should retain their traditional role of determining the license structure, if any, within their state. And this helps. I mean, the only difference is this requires a mandatory DEA registration. But other than that, the final order is permitting the states to continue to have control over their traditional role of determining the licensing structure. So I would say, as a whole, the final order is doesn't really harm what we were doing, and is a step in the right direction. Adam, let me hand it back to you, and then hopefully we can answer some questions.
Yeah, I agree with that assessment. In many ways, the statements that were conceived by the commission are consistent with what this order provided. Although there are certain instances that this order was inconsistent, one of them being with the statement around the products being regulated by their end use, intoxicating potential formulation. The inconsistency, at least as we sit today, is that the exact same product with the exact same brand and the exact same formulation can still be treated differently, whether it's sold as a medical product or an adult use product, and be in a completely different classification. But what Eric was speaking to is to the simplicity that they created. And one of the core principles around the commission was the idea of recognizing and respecting the state's authority in regulating these products, where it could have become exceedingly complicated for operators if the DEA or another government agency decided to shape brand new rules and regulations that all of these operators would be required to adhere to. And instead, they said that as long as you are operating within the confines of your existing state legal cannabis framework, that is the requirement to be in compliance with federal law, along with these smaller steps like DEA registration. And part of the reason why this state autonomy model is so important at this point in time is because in bringing these groups together, it becomes very clear how different the regulatory environments are that each of these companies have relied on in investing in their business. The needs of a California dispensary are very different from the needs of a Georgia hemp operator, while each one of them had invested based on the rules that were available to them at that time in their state. So while over time, we want to see more consistency in regulation, particularly around safety standards, quality control, labeling, testing, because that's important to make sure consumers can make informed decisions. The smoothest path to moving forward while having so many different business models is to respect the authority that the states have had in shaping these programs to date. And at least from what we have so far with this order, pending the results of the hearing, the order seems to be going in the right direction.
Adam, let me just add to that a little bit, is to kind of what the future holds there, right? And so just as a quick update to this group, and I just say this because I've expressed a lot of optimism and I understand that, but I also understand things will get screwed up, right? I mean, like, there are just a lot of ways that it will not be as streamlined as I'm suggesting. And I mean, just small things like the DEA portal was supposed to be open at at 9 a.m. Eastern time this morning, and it opened just barely, but now there's a glitch and it's not up and running, right? I mean, that is like presumably despite best of intentions, but who knows? And at the beginning, you could only use PayPal, but they just have expanded that to ACH, right? I mean, I say this because all of this is still going to require a lot of flexibility. And we still have very different state programs, and we still have state programs that, as things stand now, don't permit interstate commerce. So I think a lot of the work that we're going to have to do is with the states, the state legislators, and the state regulators. And quite frankly, I've been saying that for a while, that I think regardless of what happens at the federal level, a lot is going to remain at the state level, and we need to be working with states to advance the goals, the areas of agreement that we found, Adam, and including now working with the states to expand their medical programs. But when we talk about um, some of the standards that we believe should be put in place to make sure that there are safe products going to market, some states do a better job of that than others. And some states have excessive, unnecessary standards and requirements. So I think a lot of the work we can do is with the states to help them advance these policies that we believe are in the interest of most stakeholders.
Yeah, exactly right. And there remain many unanswered questions, and some questions are unanswered because the answers are yet to be written. And we as an industry and a community have to recognize that we hold a great deal of power if we're working together to shape what that future can look like. And in terms of what those policy efforts look like, so I lead the NCIA, And we are really trying to advocate for businesses across the cannabis ecosystem, particularly small businesses. And I saw a question in the chat around if the update to federal policy is going to disproportionately help MSOs. And I tend to hold the opposite opinion, which is that the MSOs are better positioned to work through the onerous challenges of prohibition. They're able to access larger pools of capital. They have war chests already of tens and in some cases hundreds of millions of dollars. And so I have always viewed forward progress as disproportionately helping small businesses and social equity operators who might not have access to the banking relationships that these MSOs have. And also just important to reiterate that the MSOs, the large businesses, are not the enemies of the cannabis movement. There really is no such thing today as big weed or big business. They are all small compared to the types of businesses and other industries that might choose to come in and try to compete at a later point. And these larger businesses are also the ones that will be acquiring the smaller businesses and the social equity operators. So it's all part of one ecosystem. And from what I've seen, the small businesses, the social equity businesses have been suffering the most under prohibition. And my hope is that the lifting of these barriers will disproportionately help them in competing against the operators that have been better funded.
Yeah, I mean, I think good things help all of us. And I'll just say, I mean, I'm very involved in the business side of this, right? I mean, I lead a law group that helps a lot of businesses, but from the personal perspective, and I also understand how multidimensional this is, but I'm just saying from my personal perspective, I look at this from a patient's perspective. What is good for safe, legal, affordable access? And I use patients pretty broadly here. Um, and yeah, I think this is a good thing for that. And will there be winners and losers among businesses? That was always going to be the case. I mean, there's never going to be any policy change that doesn't do that because everyone's sitting here, I don't mean on the call, but generally people who are in the business of cannabis, and I include hemp in that, are trying to figure out what the law and regulations will look like in the future and trying to point their business in that direction. And by the way, the larger the business is, it's like a big boat. It's harder to re-steer in some ways. But everyone's trying to do that, and we are all slaves to the politicians because we don't always know what they're going to do. And then you get a result. And I think if we look at, take it 2 years ago and took a vote on basically would hemp be put back into marijuana largely, and would state legal marijuana be federally legal? I don't think most people would have gotten that, right? I don't think most people would have predicted that correctly. And I could be wrong on that, but I think most people would not have. So of course that's going to have an impact on businesses. Businesses were steering their business with certain assumptions, and then there are changes in the law, and it affects some more than others. And I try to help my clients as much as I can, but I certainly am not the hand of God that can determine who wins and who loses here, right? And I think inevitably that's the nature of capitalism in the United States. But who does win here is patients who want safer, legal, more affordable access to medical cannabis.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And with the laws changing so quickly and dramatically, we see winners and losers being determined by policy shifts when really what's best for the patients and consumers is the winners to be chosen by who's providing the best, cleanest, safest product, the most innovation, the most affordable prices. And so the hope is that this order and this progress in federal policy is a step toward more political stability and more regulatory stability for these businesses to be able to strategize and invest in the infrastructure of knowing that those are products that they'll be able to sell and that the distribution will be fixed going into the future.
Hey, Adam, let me try to answer the remaining questions really quickly. There's a
Sure.
question on impact on tribally owned cannabis businesses. So the final order doesn't really address that directly, which is kind of interesting, right? And I would read the it's a combination of it doesn't affect tribal sovereignty, right? So a lot of the tribes, depending on tribal sovereignty, like this final order, doesn't really affect that. But the tribes can uh, avail themselves of the positive aspects here, right? Can get registered if they want. The rescheduling positively affects. So there are things like that. It's a bit of a complicated question. I was trying to think of how to synthesize it, but I mean, the fact that it's not addressed directly create some uncertainty. And there was also a question about international and what does the reference to export license mean? And my understanding of that, particularly in the context of international law and the Single Convention Treaty, is now that medical cannabis, state licensed medical cannabis operators with a DEA registration will be deemed federally legal, they likewise can export product. I say likewise to the currently registered bulk manufacturers of cannabis. So those folks who become federally legal will be able to export product and import product for scientific and medical purposes. Medical purposes, my reading would include a lot of the distribution in Germany right now.
Mm-hmm.
But there were lots of other complications with that. I'm just saying that opens that door, but how to do it is a whole nother question.
Yeah, to Eric's point, the opportunity to participate in the international market has been precluded to this point. And so while the exact framework is unclear, this order also does provide opportunities for US businesses to expand their addressable market to international opportunities. And then there was another question, Eric, that you'd be best served to answer on the risk of enforcement on what the comment referred to as federally illegal products marketed as hemp, and if this order affects the likelihood.
So I don't know what the level of federal enforcement will be and what they'll do. I do not read this as suggesting that the federal government will increase enforcement against what is now categorized as adult use cannabis, right? I mean, I know a lot of folks are like, they're right away they're permitting medical and right away they're going to crack down on adult use. And I mean, I can't rule that out under any administration, but I don't anticipate that, and it would be so vastly unpopular that I mean it's just kind of, I don't think that's going to happen. Whether there will be, there right now is direct to consumer sales of products that, I won't argue about their legality now. They will be, come November, with no additional change in law, unequivocally federally illegal. And whether the federal government, does something about that, probably. But I mean, the additional problem for those companies, and I understand, I don't mean to be indelicate here. I mean, the developments are not good for the hemp companies right now as things stand. I mean, the ones that sell high THC ingestible products, like these developments are not in their favor, and I don't want to sugarcoat that. Um, it's not so much whether there'll be enforcement, but they're going to lose access to bank accounts, lose access to real estate. I don't mean wholesale across the board, but I think that directionally, businesses will be less likely to want to do business with a hemp company and more likely to want to do business with a fully federally legal medical cannabis company. And that's just the way the things are rolling.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. And it's the opposite of what we see today with more strategic investment going into products like hemp beverages and hemp THC because they fall outside of the typical restrictions. And while I'll caveat with saying anything is possible, I find it difficult to predict an inverse correlation of enforcement to the regulatory restrictions around cannabis. The fact that it is now going from a Schedule 1 to Schedule 3 to me would signal a lower risk of federal enforcement, at least against licensed state regulated operators. And then the outlook for these hemp products could look very different after the redefinition goes into effect in November, when these products that have operated under a federally legal framework will now have any products with above a de minimis level of THC be considered federally illegal and without the protections of being within a state licensed dispensary model, which this recent order has legitimized, at least on the medical side.
Man, we're over time. I could go. Can we go
Yeah.
another hour, Chris?
I wish we could. There's so much to cover here, especially with the recent changes. But thank you, Eric and Adam, for giving this information and give us an update on what's happening. Thanks for everyone for joining. We will have another webinar next month that we'll be announcing soon. Highly encourage everyone on the call to get involved with NCIA, support their work, and connect with Adam to understand how you can spread this message and help promote the important work that they're doing. So wish everyone a great afternoon, and hope you do join the next webinar next month.
Thanks, Chris. And briefly, I'll mention the NCIA lobby days are May 12th to 14th for anyone that's interested in showing up in Washington, D.C. and having your voice directly in the offices of our lawmakers. It would be great to see any of you there that are able to attend.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's a great event that they've been doing for a long time. So encourage you all to support that work at Lobby Days.
Awesome.
So, Chris, thanks for having us on. And Adam, it's always great talking with you about this. And thank you for your leadership on these issues as well.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thanks. Appreciate
definitely.
it, Chris. Thanks, Eric.
Yeah.
And thank you,
Have a great
everyone.
day.
All right,
Time.
take care all.